All right, guys, so we've done a lot of work up to this point. So we've created code that allows, or forms that allow our users to enter data, and we've created event handlers to capture that data and send it to the server, so the server, or send it to some type of storage mechanism so it can be saved. All right, so now we need to prepare to display data back to our customers or back to our users. All right, so when you think about how you start to interact with these applications, you want to change your mindset, because the trap that I'm seeing a lot of you fall into is you try to be too literal with how you study this stuff. All right, and by that I mean, let's say we're in COP 1000, and I give you an example problem. This is a loop that counts from 1 to 10. All right, so you'll study that loop, and you'll study that loop, you'll study that loop. And then I'll say, all right, now create code that counts the number of customers in a list. And some people can't make that jump because they focus so much on how to write a loop that counts from 1 to 10 that they miss that it's the same thing. You're writing a loop that counts something. The same approach still applies. But if you focus on just that particular syntax to do that particular thing, you'll never be able to move to or transition to other things. So we have to think general. Now, what that means to us in this class is that we need to look at what is being done and why it's being done. All right? So as we get ready to display data back to our DOM, the first thing we want to consider, and you always want to consider, is what is a part of our requirement. All right, so what we're trying to do in Coffee Run right now is we capture user data, but whenever the user enters an order, we want them to see, or want the pending orders to be displayed. So your requirement would say something like, whenever a user submits a truck order, then the truck order or the coffee order should be displayed to the user. All right, so it won't say anything about how you do that or where you do that. That's up to the developer to interpret and figure out. That is our job. That is what we do. All right. So when you break down a problem like that, the first thing you want to ask yourself is, well, what is a part of that? What components do I need? Well, we know the user needs to create an order. All right. So we would create a form where they could create that order. Well, how does that data get captured? Well, we know it's a form, so we know that forms have a submit event, so that means we know we need something to capture the submit event for that form. Well, we know we need to get that data from the form, so how are we going to get that data from the form? Well, when the form is submitted, so whatever event handles that submit event should have code to grab the values from the form. All right. Well, we know we need to do something with that data. All right. Well, what do we want to do with it? Well, in some cases we want to store it. In some cases we want to process it. In some cases we want to send it someplace else. Well, we need code that does that. So it's a logical thing. You have to break it up into components to effectively write the code. All right. So now we're focusing on how we display data back. So in the case, and we'll use Coffee Run as our context. All right. So in Coffee Run, the user has a form where they, add their coffee order into their email, select short, tall, or grande or whatever, and they select what type of flavor shot they have, right? Once they submit that form, we want to see a list of their pending orders, right? So how do we do that, right? We don't know. In HTML, we would create a static site, right? And in that static site, we would just have a list with list items, and we hard code that in there, right? Well, can we do that in a dynamic application that accepts orders? No, because we would need to know what list items need to go on the page before we actually, save the page and display it. That means it would all be hard coded in the HTML. That means they would never be able to add another order or add another item or delete an item, because we have hard coded them all before we displayed the page to the user. So we can't use that approach. We need a more dynamic approach. Well, if we think about it, we want a page that's going to display something or a list of something at a later date. All right. We don't know what that thing is, but we want to do it at a later date. All right. So if we think about that in real life, there's a concept very familiar to that, right? I may have a book that has something in it that I want to read at a later date. So I'll put a placeholder in that book at the point where I want to come back to it, right? So we do the same thing in HTML. What we want to do is create a placeholder to store something at a later date. So what we'll do on our page is create a placeholder to store checklist items at a later date, right? That later date means when that JavaScript runs and processes something, it's going to insert elements back into the DOM at that particular placeholder's point, all right? So how do we set up that placeholder, all right? Well, we can take advantage. Let's look at the code here. Right here, the form is all above here, but we can take advantage of CSS, all right? So here we've created a div, and you see class equals panel dash default, all right? Well, what that is Bootstrap code. That just gives us some cool styling to make our panel pretty. Bootstrap has classes that you can apply to your code, and it'll make it pretty for you, right? So if you've included Bootstrap, then you can use these classes to make it pretty. But we don't necessarily need that for our code, right? We just need the div to hold something. We can give it our own class. It doesn't have to be pretty, but this makes it prettier, right? So if you didn't read that section, this link is how you would link the style sheet for Bootstrap, all right? And that would include it in your page. All right, so in that div, we have another div that represents our panel body. A panel is just a placeholder to hold these things called panels, right? So if you think about a house, and in these old school houses, you would have these walls and they would have paneling on it, and each panel was a separate section, right? That's the same concept here. We're creating sections of panels to hold data, all right? Each panel should have, well, this original panel should have the header H4. So we have one panel, it has the header pending orders, right? But it doesn't have anything in it other than this div, all right? Well, this is an empty div here. All this div has is a selector called data coffee order equals checklist, all right? So we're giving this inner div that has nothing in it a selector called data coffee order whose value is checklist, all right? Well, what are we going to do? We're going to use this property in order to gain access to this inner div at a later date, all right? So this is essentially our placeholder. We create a panel on our page. I keep doing that. We create a panel on our page, and we give it a panel body, and we give it the heading pending orders, all right? Now we're giving it an empty div with a selector whose name we can use to retrieve this inner div. Now, because it is a DOM element, we know that we can append elements to this div. All right, so if you think about it, that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to append things that represent our coffee orders to this DOM element, right, and create that subtree. All right, so this is us creating a placeholder, so in the future we can add checklist items to this div. All right, so this is our page setup. All right, so we'll come back to this this main part right here, which is our checklist, which we're going to use momentarily. But we're going to create a module that allows us to create our checklist items and manipulate our DOM. All right, and that'll be our next video lecture. Take care.